Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm the Omni viewer, and I just materialized into the room having come back from seeing Nosferatu 2024 in theaters. That would be the remake made by Robert Eggers. Now, naturally, I'm quite familiar with Nosferatu and its legacy. You can't very well be a film buff and a horror buff and not be familiar with Nosferatu. In fact, it's very interesting how the original movie is aged. Back when it was brand new in the 20s, it was considered a disposable piece of plagiarism, and now it's considered so great that it's achieved the three I's of cinema: important, iconic, and influential. So it just goes to show you how history can be kind to certain things. And of course, I've seen Werner Herzog's remake, I've seen Shadow of the Vampire, I've listened to the song that was written by Blue Oyster Cult, I know all about the SpongeBob cameo. I think about the only version I haven't really seen is Nosferatu in Venice, although I have read about the abominable way Klaus Kinski treated his female co-stars on set in full view of everyone. And believe me, you're better off if you don't know what I'm talking about. Anyway, point is, I'm pretty well versed in Nosferatu, and I was really looking forward to seeing how this movie would pull things off. In particular, I was curious to see if it would make good on a promise that the trailers were putting forward, which was the promise to put the fear back into vampire fiction. Because let's be honest, people, vampires have not been properly scary for a very, very long time. It's been a gradual process, mind you, but they've definitely lost their bite. There are multiple reasons why. A large part of it is overexposure. Vampires are so commonly used in fiction. I don't know if they're more common than zombies, but at the very least they are tied. They might even be more common than zombies even. And overexposure inevitably leads to familiarity, and familiarity kills horror, because the horror works strongest when there's an unknown factor. And what's that so often cited H.P. Lovecraft quote, right? The greatest fear is fear of the unknown. So the more we see of vampires, the more we get to know how vampires work, the less frightening they become. That overexposure also means that their weaknesses have been overexposed as well. And vampires have a surprisingly huge number of weaknesses, to the point where, for decades now, in fact, storytellers have been struggling to figure out how to work around those and still have the vampires be effective. I mean, I played around with it myself in Occult Mafia, so it's a pretty common issue. And then, of course, there are the deliberate choices to just depict vampires as opposite to their original intention, which was as horrifying monsters. Writers have come along and written vampires as tragic, as romantic, as comedic, as sexy, you know, all these other things that aren't really... I mean, you can tell good individual stories with different versions of vampires, don't get me wrong. But at the same time, each of those iterations, as they build up, bring vampires further and further away from their monstrous origins. However, the trailers for the Nosferatu remake were putting forward the idea that they were going to make vampires scary again. They were going to take this idea that seemed like it's old hat, and we all know what vampires are like, and there's just no way you can make them scary again, and make them scary again. That's what it was putting forward, and I was hoping against hope that this would be the case. Well, that's exactly what happened. Yeah, Nosferatu definitely delivers on the front of being an effective gothic horror story. For starters, it is dripping with atmosphere. I've said in the past that when it comes to horror, I prefer atmosphere over gore. I mean, gore can be frightening, sure, but most of the time it's just shocking and exploitative. And eventually you'll get used to it. As long as it's fake, you know. Real violence is another issue. Fake violence, you just get desensitized after a while. Atmosphere is different. Atmosphere creeps into your brain. It gets under your skin. And man, the Nosferatu remake has atmosphere in spades. A friend of mine who had seen it before I did told me, without spoiling anything, that it was wall-to-wall vibe. That was the term he used. And I agree. The vibe is definitely an appropriate word. Atmosphere and emotion and mood are all what drive this thing. Not that the plot is weak, mind you, but you could have had the plot and not had the mood and the atmosphere, and it wouldn't have been nearly as effective. Getting the atmosphere right was pretty much half the battle right there. So this is one of those times where everything looks washed out and gray for like 99.9% of the movie, but that is very deliberate because it's supposed to look washed out and gray. It's supposed to have this sort of bleak atmosphere to it. There are a lot of dark shadows being cast, but again, very intentional. You're supposed to not be sure about what's lurking in the darkness. And it's very light on jump scares as well. There are a couple, and I will admit, I did jump, even if I knew they were coming, because I have gotten pretty good at telling when a movie is setting up a jump scare. But even with that in mind, I still did jump a little bit when it was appropriate to do so. Which means those jump scares were actually effective. They're not the driving force, they're very few and far between, and that also helps them be more effective. But for the most part, atmosphere is the word of the day. There are also some really interesting creative choices done in terms of updating the story and depicting certain things from it. As far as our main vampire, Count Orlok, the interesting choices made to not fully show him for a large portion of the movie. I think for roughly the first third, we don't even really get a good look at him. He's predominantly cast in silhouette. And when you add that huge cloak on top of him and his weird hunched over posture and everything, a lot of the time that silhouette doesn't even look human. Then add to the fact that most of the time we see him, he's in a setting that's already very dimly lit. That renders him a shadow among shadows. And he's also shown to be very tall and large and imposing, which just, again, adds to this sense that he is a very dark and powerful figure, a visual way of representing the supernatural abilities he has. When we finally do get a good look at him, and eventually we do, I will tell you up front, I'm not going to spoil anything, but I will say up front, do not expect a recreation of the Max Schreck makeup. That looks iconic, of course. That's what pretty much everybody pictures when they hear Nosferatu. But they didn't recreate it here. They went with something a little bit different. And when I first saw it, there was a part of my brain that thought, huh, that's what they went with? Interesting choice. However, I do think in context, it works. There are reasons why he looks that way, but I don't want to get too heavy into spoilers here, so let's just say it wasn't what I was expecting him to look like, but I do think it's effective, in the long run anyway. The plot is also expanded on in certain ways that enhance the story without taking it in a completely different direction. Now, it still follows the original movie's plot, and as we established, the original movie's plot was lifted wholesale from Bram Stoker's Dracula, with a few new elements added in. But there were certain things in that original movie. I had watched it just a couple days beforehand to make sure it was fresh in my mind, and there are some things in the original movie that, you know, the original movie might be a classic, it's not necessarily perfect. There are places that could have been expanded on to enhance it, and that's what this remake does. For example, in the original, there's a character who appears in a scene about halfway through, I want to say, and he's set up kind of like he's supposed to be the Van Helsing character, but he doesn't actually contribute anything to the plot at all. He's just kind of there. He is showing his students some carnivorous plants, and he says, Aren't they like vampires? And that's it. Clear homage to Van Helsing, sure, but not a character who actually adds to the movie. That character is Willem Dafoe's character in the remake, Dr. Von Franz. And he's actually given more of a role that's actually a lot closer to being a Van Helsing type. He still ultimately has to step back in order for the finale to play out the way it does. Again, I won't spoil too much, although it is like a century-old movie that's in the public domain, so you can watch it pretty much anywhere. But the thing is, the way his character is expanded and the way he interacts with the others is so well done that you almost don't care that he's ultimately not the same as Van Helsing in the end. So that was a good expansion. Another good expansion actually involves our leading lady, Ellen. Now, she is, of course, the object of Orlok's desire. And in the original movie, Orlok first learns of her kind of the same way that Dracula learns about Mina. He finds Thomas's locket with Ellen's picture in it, and from there he starts developing this psychic link getting inside of her head. Ellen starts sleepwalking and having these psychic fits, and that all just kind of happens as the movie is going. The remake, and again, I won't spoil too much, but we learn pretty much right away, Ellen's got a bit more of a connection with Orlok than just that. In fact, her role is slightly more important than just someone who chooses to confront Orlok at the end. Again, I won't give away too much, although the way it plays out actually makes Ellen a great example of a modern female lead in movies. I know there's a lot of debate about what that actually constitutes these days. What I will say, without giving away too much, is that Ellen in this movie is able to be the ultimate hero and be given importance without having to sacrifice any of her feminine qualities. She is still very much a woman, and that's important to how things play out by the end of the movie. Although again, I won't spoil anything. Now, even this remake isn't necessarily perfect. There are some brief moments of blood and not really gore per se, but certainly more violence than you would have seen in the 1920s. Most of the time it's used for one of those aforementioned jump scares, or to be especially shocking. And, you know, I don't necessarily think it was 100% necessary. I mean, it is a vampire story. It's difficult to tell a vampire story without there being blood somewhere in there. But it wasn't necessary to go that far. Also, there's a little bit of nudity sprinkled throughout. But my word, this movie is not a sexy movie at all. Most of the nude scenes, while not 100% explicit most of the time, it's depicted almost more like it's a locker room than it is anything that's meant to be sensual. And there is one sex scene, but it is, like, by design, kind of unsettling. It's not too graphic, mind you, but it doesn't really need to be there, so it may as well not have been there at all. I understand why it was put in there, but I don't know. It does feel like the sort of thing that was just sort of added to have it, and it could have easily been cut. But, you know, it's in there. What are you gonna do? But, you know, elements like that aren't necessarily going to detract from the overall experience. And man, Nosferatu 2024 is indeed an experience. I would, of course, recommend watching the original first. Again, public domain movie, very easy to find, and it's not going to take you too long to watch it. But this is a worthy remake. In fact, the thing I would praise the most about it is the fact that it's what remakes should be. There has been just a glut of movies coming out of Hollywood over the last few years that are incredibly sarcastic, overly self-aware, too proud of their own cleverness, not taking the source material seriously, sometimes outright despising the source material and despising the people who even like the source material. And for a while now, there's been an outcry from the audience for Hollywood to just stop doing that and give us something that's actually sincere, something that respects the source material and the audience, made by people who want to work with these properties, and which actually takes itself seriously. And Nosferatu absolutely does that. It could have been played up for camp and just sort of been a sort of self-satire. It wouldn't have taken much to push it in that direction, but it doesn't go there. It takes itself completely seriously. It takes the source material seriously. It takes the audience seriously. And as a result, it is one of the best examples of gothic horror that I have seen in a very, very long time. At least in terms of new material. Obviously, there's plenty of classic material. But this brings gothic horror back in a big way. And honestly, I kind of wish that Universal was doing this with their monsters instead of whatever they're allowing Blumhouse to do by turning the Wolfman into a little hobgoblin and making the Invisible Man a psycho ex-boyfriend. This is how it's done. The Nosferatu remake is definitely worth seeing. Just do not bring your kids to it because it is not actually based on SpongeBob. I have to stress that point. So yeah, Nosferatu 2024 gets a recommendation from me, and I'll probably be delving a little bit more into it once it's available on home media. But until such time as that happens, this is the Omni viewer signing off.